Hello everyone, I'm Ross Edwards and I've been asked to talk to you about some of my experiences as an Australian composer and the effect that living and working in this country has had on my music. I hope some of the thoughts I've collected may help you in finding your own direction. I studied in Europe for several years in the early 1970s. At that time, it was more or less obligatory for young Australian composers to spend time in either Europe or North America, and it was expected that we'd imbibe their culture, bring it home, and use it as models for our own work. This attitude, which was cynically referred to as the cultural cringe, was based on the assumption that we didn't need a voice of our own, a voice that reflected our own experience, because it was widely considered that they did things better over there in the hub of civilization, better than anything we in our remote outpost could expect to achieve. For this reason, Australian composers of an earlier generation than mine often chose to remain abroad. Since then, we've made a lot of progress in recognising that it's essential for us to develop a musical culture relevant to our own society, although it has to be said that vestiges of the cringe are still alive and well in some quarters. Gradually, composers began to listen closely to the distinctive sounds of this continent, to take seriously the wisdom of the indigenous peoples, and to become aware of our neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, whose rich and diverse cultures still include living traditions that haven't succumbed to the uniformity produced by globalisation. In some Indonesian and Australian Aboriginal music, for example, you can still hear traces of the song of the living earth, from which the music originally sprang, the drones, rhythms and melodic voices of organisms whose patterns are detectable in the music and also in dance, which is music's natural accompaniment. I should add that this music is quite as sophisticated, though in very different ways, as the European art music performed in our concert halls. When I came back to Australia, I felt lost. I'd gotten over the kind of music that was fashionable in Europe at the time, and in rejecting it, I felt I needed to go right back to the wellsprings, the voices of the earth. I put away the techniques I'd learnt and started all over again, walking through the bush and absorbing the shapes, rhythms, pulses and drones of the landscape, the same sounds heard by thousands of years of Indigenous Australians. From this enormously complex sound continuum, I distilled material that seemed to me to reflect its essence, and this became the starting point of a musical language I recognised as being my own. It was very sparse at first, a bare skeleton. Sonority replaced harmony, and the rhythmic cells and phrases were quirky, intersecting in unpredictable ways. Here's an extract from my 1978 duo for clarinet and piano, titled The Tower of Remoteness. The title tries to convey the mysteriousness of nature before it's been dissected and classified and given scientific names. The clarinet part's been compared with traditional music for the shakuhachi, which is a Japanese bamboo flute used by monks to induce a meditative state. I wasn't aware of this similarity as I composed, nor was I aware that the opening motive in the piano was unconsciously modelled on the call of the spotted pardillo, a common little bird which inhabits parks and gardens around Sydney. A sense of place, of belonging, was becoming all important to me in those days, and I can see now that my new language, as it developed, was in a sense defining territory, as does certain kinds of birdsong, and I suppose you could even make a comparison with the songs by which the indigenous peoples continuously recreate the land along their dreaming tracks or song lines. Having cast off my inherited musical language with all its rich cultural associations, I was beginning to fabricate a new one for myself from the sounds of the environment. All the rhythmic cells and patterns and the relative lengths of phrases and sections were influenced at a profound level by living organisms like cicadas, crickets and frogs, the ancient voices of the land, whose sound patterns, with their near symmetries and inconsistently varied repetition, seemed to me to be on the verge of communicating some kind of hidden message. My first attempts to compose in this way produced a series of works like the Tower of Remoteness, but were slow, calm and static. In fact, I often referred to them as musical objects of contemplation, and they eventually found uses outside the concert hall, in yoga classes and meditation, for example. After a while, I applied the techniques in a different way, in a series of dance-like chants or maninyas. This was done by adopting fast tempi and increasing the rate of varied repetitiveness while retaining the essential rhythmic and structural proportions of the slow, static works. Maninya, by the way, was a nonsense word I made up, and in my music it came to mean dance chant. The very first maninya, composed for voice and cello in 1981, reflected my growing interest in chant. Chants are universal. They have many different forms and functions, but essentially they're a series of words or syllables which are sung within a limited range. They can be rhythmic and based on repetitive patterns, and they can be intoned over a drone. A rap song is a kind of chant which usually carries a social or political message. Other forms of chant are used in functional religious music, Islamic Sufi chant, for example, or Christian plain chant, as a vehicle to take you into a state of consciousness beyond that of everyday life. Chants are sometimes performed in costume and accompanied by dance, as in Aboriginal corroboree ceremonies. And of course, the sounds of insects and cicadas can have a similarly hypnotic effect. Chants can be absorbing when you give them your full attention, and irritating if they intrude unwanted into your ordinary consciousness. Here's an example of one of my dance chants, taken from my violin concerto Maninyas, which was composed during the 1980s. Today, this piece is as often performed as a ballet as it is a straight concert hall work. See if you can trace its origins in the patterns and drones of the bush. Just the other day, outside my window, a bird sang the opening notes of my oboe concerto. This isn't an unusual occurrence. I don't, or at least I very rarely, write down birdsong with the intention of incorporating it into my music, as did, notably, the French composer Olivier Messiaen. But strands and fragments nonetheless keep finding their way into my textures, having first lodged themselves in my unconscious mind. I mentioned before the persistent little spotted pardalo, which worked its way into the tower of remoteness. Birdsong, of course, has always been irresistible to composers, and there are very many examples. Well-known ones include Beethoven's cuckoo in his Pastoral Symphony, Peter Sculthorpe's use of harmonic glissandi on the cello to imitate the sound of seagulls, and Respighi's recorded Nightingale in The Pines of Rome. Aborigines wrote songs about birds and included bird calls in didgeridoo music. We in Australia are fortunate in having some of the world's most arresting bird song, and it seems only natural to use it in our music. You don't have to reproduce it exactly, but it can inject a startling freshness into your melodic and rhythmic shapes. I once heard a very striking bird melody from which I extracted an underlying scale. As it happened, this turned out to be the blues scale, but I used it in a very unbluesy way, in a clarinet and percussion piece with the title Binyang, which simply means bird in one of the Aboriginal languages from the Sydney area. Here's a short extract. I want to make the point that while I didn't actually quote the bird song, it nevertheless had a very strong effect on the music I wrote. The rhythmic accompaniment is played on Aboriginal clapping sticks. Coming back to chant, and to the fusion of dance and chant into Maninya, it might be useful at this point to hear some more examples. As I persisted further with the practice of drawing material consciously or unconsciously from the natural environment, I began to allow the textures to become more complex, more adventurous, and more likely to include references to musical cultures from around the world that interested me. In the early Maninya pieces, I'd rejected European music altogether, although I was still open to the influence of many forms of non-Western music from which I extracted various pentatonic scales, especially from Japan and Indonesia. Drones and ostinati still formed the basis of the music, but superimposed on these were interchanges between Asian scales, medieval European modes, and fragments of plain chant. Today, the texture of a Maninya can also accommodate European counterpoint, both pre- and post-Bach, and moments of Schoenbergian chromaticism and expressionism, alongside birdsong and frog rhythms. But as I once wrote, and it still holds true, the Australian natural environment remains the supreme generative force behind all my work. The music has a world view, but it's composed from an Australian perspective. An example of a more complex Maninya is an orchestral piece I wrote in 1999. Its title, White Ghost Dancing, refers to the indigenous peoples mistaking the first Europeans for the ghosts of their ancestors. Let's listen to the opening, where insect drones and ostinati are accompanied by an interplay of two frogs, punctuated by shrieking birds, or at least they sound like birds, all compacted into a short space of time. The mournful descending melody that comes a bit later is obliquely modelled on a bird call, though it might be an imagined one, I'm not sure. And so on. The texture is like a sort of mosaic of fragments gleaned from the natural world, which my unconscious mind has processed into musical motives, and which for me have become recurring symbols in a personal ritual. It's really rather eccentric, as my wife pointed out. Unnecessarily, I thought. By the way, an expanded version of White Ghost Dancing was included in a ballet score I wrote some years ago. It seemed to cry out to be choreographed. Here's just the opening of the piece. I think you'll get the message quite quickly. Another Aboriginal reference that's crept into my work is a brief didgeridoo imitation, which I use now and again as an earth symbol and as an acknowledgement of Aboriginal culture's deep respect for and spiritual connectedness to the land. It's modelled on the didgeridoo's natural aptitude for overblowing at the interval of a tenth above the fundamental. Here's an example from my saxophone concerto Full Moon Dances. Bass clarinet and bassoons are in unison with the double basses. Following this is a series of descending phrases, often called tumbling strains, which is influenced by one of the characteristic shapes of Aboriginal chant. Apart from this one, there are very many earth symbols in my music, and the abundant ostinati and drones are obvious examples. The Earth Mother is a very strong presence in Aboriginal culture, where it is believed that the land owns its people rather than the other way around, and that a profound spiritual bond exists between the two. Since non-Indigenous people don't have the right to use Indigenous material, I represent the Earth Mother, whom I regard as a universal and indispensable symbol in our environmentally unstable times, by fragments of the European plain chant, Hail Mary full of grace, and these are apt to crop up unexpectedly in the guise of lullabies, children's songs, or even dances. I should emphasize at this point that Indigenous people are very sensitive about the misappropriation of their cultural property, and although it's likely to inspire you with ideas, it would be unethical for you to quote it directly. When you're not bound by tradition or convention, when you're working in a musical language of your own and you don't have to conform to other people's rules, this means you can actually have fun composing and get away with it. I love setting words, and I've written a lot for the voice. On the whole though, I prefer not to use music as a vehicle for bringing out subtle nuances from a subjective literary text, so I generally avoid writing art songs, although I've set poems by the Australians Michael Dransfield and recently Judith Wright, both poets with whom I can thoroughly empathise. But I'm more likely to choose texts that I can play with, muck around with, treat as chants or maninyas, and which, however profound is the underlying meaning, can benefit by being conveyed in a static mode with varied and playful repetition so that it might reach a deeper level of consciousness. This is a universal characteristic of vocal music that's non-narrative, that's about a state of being rather than of becoming, as in Aboriginal song cycles that are directly and vividly present-centred rather than narrative or descriptive. I recommend you read the poet Les Murray's wonderful, respectful parody of one of them in his Bulladila Tari holiday song cycle, which, as well as being uplifting and so musical, is about a sense of belonging and connectedness to the land. Let's hear a bit of my flower songs for 16 voices and percussion, composed in 1987. I used as the text the scientific Latin and Greek names of some Australian wildflowers, which I broke down into separate syllables and subjected to a sort of ritualistic chanting over drones and ostinati. The effect has been compared to that of a hypnotic incantation or a buzzing of bees. While we're on the subject of texts and text setting, I've collaborated several times with my friend Fred Watson, astronomer in charge of the Anglo-Australian Observatory in northern New South Wales. Fred provided the text for my Fourth Symphony, Star Chant, a large-scale work for chorus and orchestra, which Fred describes as a musical journey through Australia's night skies, which celebrates the stars in Western and Aboriginal culture with names taken from both ancient European legend and the Dreamtime stories of many different Indigenous peoples. The extract we're going to hear is from the second of the two large movements of the work. Its title is The Southern Sky, and in this bit you'll hear the chorus chanting the Latin name given to the Southern Cross, which is Crux Australis, as well as some equivalent Aboriginal names, Walluwarra, Yarando, Wanamumicha, and so on. Notice the use of varied repetition and the free treatment of syllables. Well, there's so much more I could say, but I'd like to think I know when it's time to stop. Just a few final comments I feel I should make. I mentioned before that I compose with a world view, but from the standpoint of an Australian. I think it's important to have a strong identity, a sense of place and belonging, but this doesn't mean having a parochial attitude. Whenever my music's played in other countries, people usually recognise that it's different to what they're used to. The most common reaction is that it sounds Australian, whatever that means. Although sometimes there'll be an attempt to explain it in terms of their own culture, which can be hilarious and also misleading, as when a Meninja is arbitrarily associated with minimalism. To sum up, I'd like to suggest that you minimise dependency on global fashions and instead use your unique opportunity as Australians to seek to contribute something fresh in your own voice, from the landscape, the soundscape, from your own experience, and above all, from the heart. I'll leave you with some moments near the end of my recent work, Sacred Kingfisher Psalms. What you'll hear is a crazy chorus of bird names in the language of the Gadigal people from what is now the Sydney area. Some of its early performances were at major European and American festivals, none of which I was able to attend, but I'd love to have been a fly on the wall.
Jana